We can go back to the earliest days of the internet when people talked about flames. And on YouTube, I've done some research on haters. We've seen griefers in gaming and trolling, where people will crash in games and try to make trouble for people. And so I was curious, as I came across some rant videos in my work on YouTube, how it fit into these prior conceptions. And one of the things that's very interesting is that there's a mythos that basically, a technological determinist mythos, that when you go online, you suddenly become like Mr. Hyde, you know, that you were mild-mannered, then you go online and you're like a maniac. And there's been decades and decades of research basically punching pretty big holes in that mythos, but it really persists. Even among my students who are 18, 19, they'll have these kinds of ideas. But we know that there's a bajillion interactions that are anonymous online that go on perfectly fine without people turning crazy. And we know that from the great work of the linguist Susan Herring that people tend to bring their baggage, if they're racist, offline, why they bring it online. So I was curious, given that the cultural context is so important, is what is it with ranting? What is that? How does that fit into this landscape of so-called problematic talk online? So first of all, rants are really old. I mean, we can go back to Cicero. And people have been ranting and seeing it as a skill, actually, to be able to cut one's enemies down and so forth. So when I looked at the prior literature on ranting, I saw that there's some ideas about it. Bruman has some work where it's kind of associated a lot with flaming, and ranting is talked about as kind of another way of flaming, getting very emotional and kind of rambling, actually, not really kind of a stream of consciousness of emotion without any kind of argument. So it was often associated with flames. You can go back to some of the earliest netiquette sort of things with Tom Mandel and other people, and they would use those words interchangeably, flames and rants. And Manning's done some very interesting work on stupid customer of the week stories, where people, baristas at Starbucks, will go on these online sites and they'll try to come up with some way of having psychical relief for customers that just can't get it right. You know, it's a venti, darn it, not a large, or whatever it is at Starbucks. So they needed some way of ranting so that they can get it off their chest. But I was wondering if that's the kind of thing, though, that I'm seeing in the contemporary rant videos on YouTube. So I wondered, what are video rants? I came across them when I was doing my work, as I said, on kids on YouTube. And I wondered, are they just rambling stream of consciousnesses, or do they have some kind of structure? Are they selfish, where people are just trying to get something off their chest? Who's doing all this ranting anyway? And do they have functions in online discourse? I collected a corpus of some rants, and I did notice, actually, that in this corpus, a large majority, it's a small corpus, it's a qualitative corpus, 35 videos. But I noticed that there was a kind of a similarity between some of these rants that I were looking at. And first of all, almost all of them, to a T, were able to articulate some kind of social problem. And of course, the sociologists say that a problem becomes a social problem if enough people think it's a problem, or enough important people think it's a problem, then it's a social problem. So they're not just talking, in other words, about like what their Aunt Irma did last week. They're talking about something that is of interest to a lot of people on YouTube. So they did display emotion, heightened awareness of a problem. And here's what I thought was very interesting, a little spoiler alert. They actually offered proposals for future action. So I thought that was very significant. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So just to kind of be clear about my corpus, basically, as I said, I stumbled across a few of them. 4 of them are found from prior work. And then I went and I looked for rants on YouTube using search keywords like rant on YouTube or YouTube rant. And I was basically interested in what are people complaining about on YouTube? What's their kind of the thing that's getting stuck in their craw? So I like to tell my students, I listen to people complain all day, and they think that's a really weird way to spend your sabbatical, but anyway. So I actually came up with a definition based on these similarities that I saw across these rants. They're emotional messages exhibiting often anger or frustration that actually identify a problem or criticize things, such as some kind of behavior or technical device or feature. So again, there's this idea of something consistent across the rants. So in terms of who is ranting, well, most of them are men, a lot of them are white, So we have 60% of the corpus is white males, followed by white females, and then black females. So again, if the technology were making us all rant, then we would expect these numbers to be much more even, right? But there's something going on that maybe is culturally encouraging certain groups to rant more than others. So this is unfortunately beyond my research, but it is something that I'm going to put a pin in it and hopefully in the future attend to that, because I think that's an interesting finding. So what are people actually ranting about? Well, they're ranting about things like unfair video removals, capacious enforcement of copyrights, technical glitches, the way that YouTube has implemented business practices that are not favorable necessarily to all creators and their sharing of advertisement revenues, racism, haters, YouTube celebrities who tend to hog the limelight, and critiques of design. YouTube, for the last few years, has just constantly been changing its page layouts, and people have gotten very frustrated with that, so they will rant about that. And one thing I think is interesting is that, again, the example that I just happen to have there, she's actually ranting about, people that tend to be like the popular kids in high school, that tend to be rooted and attentive to other kinds of YouTubers. And she specifically says, I'm not going to call out names, I'm not going to go there. So it's interesting. It's not about an ad hominem attack like a flame used to be, or at least that's the way it was characterized. In other words, a lot of these rants are really kind of objecting to classes of people. They're calling out a problem that a group of people or a corporate entity is conducting, rather than just aiming their anger at one person. It's much more involved in terms of the entity that they're calling out for their behavior. So I do need to point out that these are self-labeled rants. So I decided that as a researcher, I wasn't going to try and determine, oh, that's a rant, I think that's a rant. At the beginning, I just wanted to know who thinks that they're ranting. So the labels or the description or something in their video says that they're ranting. So they'll say, warning, rant, I'm going to rant today about YouTube's business practices or something. And so that's significant, because if I were to go in there as a researcher and start to say, well, this person's ranting, then I'm kind of creating that label. And there may be value to that kind of research. But it gets tricky because, who's making that definition? It becomes very subjective. So at least I wanted to start out with things that they said that were rants. But I think it's interesting also because they're providing a kind of a warning. So it's like, it's not so much an attack, but saying, hey, if you want to watch this, you can, but be forewarned. So there's a sensitivity that's being displayed there that's different from some of these other categories of attack. Okay, so this actually is not in the corpus. I have now spent a sabbatical collecting a bigger corpus of rants, and so I'm going to be getting my teeth into that. But I thought it would be interesting to see just a snippet from Angry Joe's show about his idea about copyright. So his beef is that he's actually a pretty big YouTuber. He's got millions of views on his videos. He's got millions of subscribers. He earns a living off of YouTube and YouTube-related activities, and he's very ticked off about the fact that the automatic content ID system flags a lot of his videos, because what does he do? He does a lot of reviews of games and movies, and so he's always showing clips. So if he's showing something crummy in a game, he wants you to be able to see why it works that way. So he puts that in, content ID flags it, YouTube says you got to take that sucker down. He gets ticked off because he spends a lot of time doing a very well-crafted video that has very important information for the gaming community or people who are watching movies to know about. And so it means that he could not have ad revenue that's on the video. And he actually thinks there's a bigger issue, which is it threatens fair use, because that is an example of fair use. And these automated systems don't care. They just find it, flag it, and then if you get 3 strikes, your account can be suspended. So there's issues. So I thought I would give you 1 minute of Angry Joe. I promise I won't make you watch more than that. But I do think just to give you a little taste of what these rants look like, maybe we can experience this. What happened to my sound? Why would that go away?
Interesting.
This is good. Dub it. Someone dub it, please.
Yeah.
Someone dub it.
Let's go run it in.
I hate puppies.
Sorry, somebody unplugged my sound.
Can you try again?
Sure. Oh, this looks promising.
What the f*** you do? You guys are being complete assholes. What the hell happened to you? I cannot believe you're doing this. This is wrong. This is stupid. Why the hell would you punish all of the people who you have profited off of for years? Because a few people are uploading full movies to YouTube or full songs to YouTube. You want to hurt everyone with this stupid-ass new content ID system. Over 62 of my videos are now flagged. Ironically, most of the ones that are 1 million views or more, yeah, gotta have a piece of those. By publishers, various companies I've never even heard of, which I'm pretty sure are full of shit. I'm getting flagged for music that is playing from the game in the background, which is a part of the game, demonstrating the game. What the?
Okay. I think we get a taste from Angry Joe. And so I just wanted to kind of give you what they kind of look like. But it's interesting because, again, he's talking about fair use. He's talking about trying to figure out ways to deal with this problem so that he can say what he needs to, because he didn't think it was fair. For example, one of the examples that 11 seconds of a screenshot from a game video meant that he had to surrender all of the ad revenue to that one person. That didn't make any sense. I mean, he spent a lot of time and money putting and crafting together this game review and so forth. So what happened? What was the outcome? Well, people started to contact him and said, "You're a big YouTuber. We're little YouTubers. This happens to us all the time. So welcome to the party." So we started to get a formation of a coalition because people were starting to say, "Hey, this isn't cool." And then because he is a bit more of a bigger YouTuber, it got picked up in the media. I believe Forbes magazine had a discussion of it, and then it got discussed on gaming blogs and so forth. And so in another video where he's a little bit calmer, he starts to propose solutions like, well, hey, maybe they could get a percentage of the video. But it was interesting to see that he actually is talking about social problems, even though he's extremely emotional while he does it. So I was curious, okay, how do people react to this video? So there were like thousands of comments. So I took a random sample of 330. And almost nobody called out the video for being inappropriate, like, hey, you're ranting, like this is impolite or anything like that. So it's very small. One person called it uncalled for, and that was, so it ends up being like 2% of the sample. 25% of the sample expressed direct alignment with him in the comments, like, I agree with that, or yeah, I hate the new layout, or whatever it is that people are complaining about. And so 32% provided support to the ranter, like, I love your videos, or things like that. So it's providing support rather than, engaging with the content. So in when we get to the conclusions, what we do see is that the rants are not chaotic. They're not just rambles of a stream of consciousness emotion. They have a structure. People start out with a problem, they elaborate on the problem, they come up sometimes with solutions, and then they sometimes come up with emotional motivators where they say, hey, YouTube, come on, you should really think this through because we need to share this revenue. And so that's the classic pipeline for civic engagement, is identifying a problem, articulating it, getting your contingent to agree, coming up with some solutions, and then motivating people. I mean, that is like, if you go back to the basics of civic engagement pipeline, that's what it looks like. So it's interesting, we're on kind of that trajectory for some of these rants. So I found out that rants are different from flames and from hating. They're not directed at individuals, but really toward categories of persons that were a problem. Most of the commenters didn't read them as impolite. And it may be true that ranters help people, rants help people find psychical relief, and I turn to the psychologist to determine that. I cannot really determine that without asking them in qualitative interviews. But what was interesting is that they really did talk about solutions. So it wasn't just about psychical relief, as Manning had found in his corpus, in his study of Starbucks baristas that had, had enough. So it's very interesting to see when we start to look at the literature and the way this is being framed. Very interesting paper by Lange and Stenner talk about now this idea of the emotional public sphere. So we're all probably familiar with Jürgen Habermas's classic idea of the public sphere, where he traced certain political changes in the bourgeoisie in the 18th and 19th century, which allowed public discourse about problems of mutual concern. And so it's been a very lightning rod for civic engagement to think about how can we create a public sphere, can we create a public sphere through social media, how can we be more inclusive, because the public sphere had kind of an expansive quality to it. As long as you could make an argument, you could join the public sphere and then try to persuade other people. But Lange and Stenner argued that actually what we're looking at in a lot of ways could be characterized as an emotional public sphere, where it's not so much about always making a rational argument, but using emotions in a way that tries to help people connect. And again, it's not something new in a sense. I mean, the paper came out in 2005, but we can go back to Aristotle, where he talks about, pathos as one of the major ways that we get our point across is through emotions. And in our present environment, I actually get pretty worried about this idea of an emotional public sphere and what that means. But what's interesting, I think, about the rants is that it's not like it just leaves logic behind, right? Again, it's not just a spouting of emotion. Like there's something going on with that argument that can be quite convincing. So when you look at contemporary civic engagement scholars, and they're saying we need to understand that emotions can be strategically used by activists and be the basis for strategic thought. So it's not like, your thought is always completely rational. Like you have emotions behind the reasons that you have certain political views. And these scholars are saying we need to pay attention to that. And I just love this quote from Annette Markham, who's been studying online things for many, many years. She early on recognized that the internet and daily life were very much so intertwined. And so she's a very important figure in this discipline. And she said on her blog, it may seem like people are complaining about silly things in these videos because they're complaining about YouTube layouts or glitches or things like that. But she argues something really important. We need these infrastructures if we're going to have a public sphere on social media, if we're going to have social justice and be able to find coalitions of like-minded people. And so she says these protests push back against models that are not friendly for vernacular users to be able to express themselves. So it's wrong to just sort of shrug it off and go, oh well. I mean, in the early days of YouTube, when I studied the very early adopters, they were saying things like, well, you get to put your videos up there for free, and if the YouTube wants to do it that way, And no, we can't just settle for that kind of thing, because if we want to be able to talk about things that are important to us, we need a platform that's user-friendly and has the right kinds of features that will help us do that. So these rants in a lot of ways do help us think about that and think about how we can change the features that will be more user-friendly. So future directions. Obviously I think it would be interesting to look at maybe differences, cultural differences, class differences in ranting. It's a bit beyond what I can talk about today, but I think it's something that is going to be brewing as I look through my brand new corpus of 100 rant videos taken from different kinds of social media now, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth. And I'm going to see if there's any differences between what the YouTubers are ranting about, or maybe some similarities with what other people are ranting about. But I'm also concerned about power, and I'm wondering if maybe the rant videos seem, more acceptable in some senses because these are the little guys, right? And what happens though when somebody who's already in power uses rants, to affect change? So what's going on there? So I think that would be a very interesting study that maybe I could link up with somebody who's already studying politicians and is willing to watch all of those rants. Because I'm happy to watch the YouTube rants, but I'm not so sure about those others. So maybe a conversation would be in order. And actually, what is the role of the more popular creators? I mean, I think it's interesting that Angry Joe Show is a bigger YouTuber, so to speak, among the little guys, because maybe he can be a kind of ambassador. When other little guys aren't being listened to, maybe the larger YouTubers can help have these coalitions and motivate people. So I think that would be an interesting thing to study. And then lastly, I'm a little bit concerned about the entertainment aspect of it, right? I mean, these things are fun to watch, especially if somebody's good at it. And so where does the entertainment just kind of quash an ability to take this to the next step? So I think it would be interesting for future studies to trace the civic life of the rant and see what kind of discourse it promotes and what kinds of changes it might activate. So that ends my talk for today. The theme today was social justice through technology. Just kidding, Kira.